From the newsroom of Impact Alpha, I'm Brian Walsh, and this is your Impact Briefing for Friday, June 11th. Today, our Roundtable regulars, Imogen Rose-Smith and David Bank, are back to reimagine capitalism, handicap the other race in New York City, discuss toxic masculinity in impact investing, and also discuss how the Gates Foundation's strategy for global access to COVID vaccines has worked or hasn't worked. Hi, Imogen.
Hi, Brian.
Hi, David.
Hey, Brian and Imogen, good to see you both.
Good to be with you. But first, here's what you need to know from this week in impact investing. The G7 is meeting this weekend in Cornwall, England, to hammer out a global vaccine plan, rally momentum for climate action, and talk tough on Russia. On the table, a 15% global corporate tax rate. Mostly, it seems that these global leaders are just relieved that they don't have to deal with, well, you know who. The G7 finance ministers earlier endorsed mandatory climate reporting in line with the TFCD, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Next up, biodiversity loss, ecosystem degradation, and the loss of natural capital. The Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures is aiming to create a similar framework to help organizations report and act on nature-related risks. There were some huge fundraisers this week. The Swedish battery manufacturer Northvolt raised $2.8 billion to expand its gigafactory from 40 to 60 gigawatt hours of annual capacity. Northvolt says it has $27 billion in contracts with customers, including a $14 billion partnership with Volkswagen to supply lithium-ion batteries for its electric vehicles in Europe. Nubank, a Brazilian digital bank, or neobank, brought in $1.2 billion at a valuation of $30 billion. Nubank provides no-fee, low-interest digital credit cards that can be managed on a smartphone. The company says it has 40 million customers and is adding 45,000 customers each day. It's now expanding to Mexico and Colombia. At the other end of the fundraising spectrum, Iongo Capital in Uganda backed Qualito, an avocado and macadamia nut producer, and Cresta, which produces electrical poles from sustainably sourced eucalyptus. They also exited their loan to Western Uganda Cotton Company, which sources cotton from smallholder farmers. And also, Impact Alpha is reimagining capitalism. In partnership with Omidyar Network, we'll be digging into ideas, rules, and power relationships for the next version of the market-based economy. Check out David's podcast interview with Omidyar's Chris Jorgens, wherever you listen. And now it's time for our roundtable. The crew has a lot to chew on this week. Let's start with that last headline. David, what's all this talk about reimagining capitalism?
Well, Brian, it's kind of been, on everybody's lips for a while, and the pandemic obviously accelerated it all. What we're doing with the Omidyar Network is queuing up, as you said, the ideas, the rules, and then the power dynamics involved in sort of taking market-based economics to the next stage. What's interesting is, there's obviously a critique from the outside, but there's starting to be, of course, a critique from the inside, from corporations, from finance, and others that, many of the mechanisms that have gotten us here are not going to take us to the future. And, readers of Impact Alpha, listeners to this podcast know what we're talking about. But what's interesting is that there's lots of policy ferment on the table around disclosure. You mentioned that in the headlines, around materiality of environmental, social, and governance factors, obviously, and all kinds of things around compensation. What's interesting about what Omidyar is doing is they're very keen on, even things that aren't as popular among finance and investors sometimes, worker power, disadvantaged communities, the marginalized communities. How do you change the actual power dynamics so that this market-based economy can actually work for all?
So, Imogen, are you on board with reimagining capitalism?
I am very much on board with reimagining capitalism, although I retain skepticism about how effective that will be if we don't truly change the power dynamics that have gotten us to the situation that we are currently in. And I'm also not sure that it's entirely about reimagining capitalism so much as potentially going back to things such as, organized labor that kept some elements of the power dynamics that we have in our current capitalist system in check so that there was greater wealth distribution.
In your recent column in Impact Alpha, you picked up on some of these issues around power dynamics and some of the blowhards in impact investing.
I did. So my most recent column was about toxic masculinity in impact investing and how we've sort of seen this almost like pull toward of suddenly assets going to funds predominantly run or overseen by powerful white men. Not really a surprise given that, the prominence of private equity in impact and some of the sort of characters at the very top of the heap, the sort of Leon Blacks and Bill McLachlan's of this world have exhibited, questionable behavior to say the least. But really, it wasn't, the issue is not about, white men being terrible. The issue is power, right? And it's about, if we don't change the power dynamics that underlie finance, then we're just repeating and upholding the systems that are in place that are creating exactly the types of inequalities that impact investing was meant to be addressing. And what you've seen as impact investing has become more successful and more mainstream, it's consciously or not, it's been co-opted by the types of power dynamics and power structures that it seeks to undermine. And I think that dynamic is kind of dangerous.
Is this picking up on the Audre Lorde sentiment around the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house?
Yeah, when you're threatening the very system, and it's sort of an inherent contradiction within impact investing, right? Because impact investing believes that the tools of capitalism can be used to achieve better social goals. And, that makes sense. But the problem is the tools of capitalism are predominantly in the hands of the people who have benefited from the current system, which more often than not is white men.
How
does that line up with this theme of reimagining capitalism?
Well, I think, the power dynamics are central, as Imogen says. And, one of the things that comes up, as you say, is, when you just call it capitalism, whether it's reimagined or not, you've kind of put your finger on the scale that capital is the center of the equation, as opposed to, for example, labor, as we've been talking about. So there is going to be a contest for power in this. I think what does come through is that market-based solutions don't necessarily have to reinforce the existing power relations. That's maybe what we're trying to tease out here. How, and as Imogen said, maybe it's a fool's errand, but how can these tools that do produce lots of innovation and progress, how can they be really harnessed for different ends, so that we optimize a system for equity, for justice, for regeneration, sustainability, and all the rest? We'll see.
So it's not dismantling the master's house, but maybe building a different house altogether.
There you go.
So Imogen, I understand that you also have another column lined up talking about the hot election in New York City, and no, not the upcoming mayoral race, but the Comptroller race, which is essentially the chief financial officer for the city. Why are you focused on this race?
Well, so no one in the broader world cares about the Comptroller's race, right? Like, most people likely don't know who the Comptroller is and don't know what they do. But
you just hurt the feelings.
Well, as the resident Californian here and non-New Yorker, I'm always amused that New Yorkers think the entire world should be fixated on their local election. But that's, I guess, the world we live in.
You mean the city that is the largest city in the United States, and also still probably the central global financial capital?
You've just proven my point, Brian.
And also, to my point, has the 5th largest pension system in the US. So what makes the Comptroller race important to those amongst us who are pension nerds is the impact on the New York City pension system. So Scott Stringer has been the Comptroller for 8 years because, again, nobody cares about the Comptroller. So if you become the Comptroller, you're likely going to win the election again, and you term out after 2 years.
After 2 terms.
Sorry, after 2 terms, exactly. So Scott Stringer's not running again. He's actually running for mayor, and there's going to be a new Comptroller. And that means that you are likely to see changes at the pension fund. And what you've been seeing, and this is true not obviously just of New York, but also Democrat states and municipalities, is ESG is becoming increasingly central to these conversations. So particularly with regards to climate change, and also, diversity and inclusion. But what happens is, when people run for office, they make all these grand promises of what they're going to do, and then they get in office and nothing really happens. Until, and this is what happened in New York City, 7 years later, when suddenly Scott Stringer wants to run for mayor and Mayor de Blasio wants to take on the governor, then they put in place a string of changes to actually start investing capital in green strategies. And so my point in part is that, we, not just in New York, but across, the country, need to ask more of our elected officials. We need to make it not about politics, but more about policy, and really ensuring that pension plans are implementing ESG strategies, not because they're good politics, but because they're good investments, and they need to happen.
It is interesting that this is one of the rare cases where there's sort of a voter participation in actual, at least in the people who will be making actual investment decisions. Do you think, Imogen, that ESG and impact actually are sort of winning, political planks in an election?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So the candidate who's in the lead, Corey Johnson, he has sort of run on a pretty traditional ticket that just says we should pay less in fees to Wall Street, which is pretty popular. But the two candidates who are coming second, and by the way, the polling is terrible because A, no one's really focused on the election because of COVID, and B, no one knows what the Comptroller is, so no one really knows who's running. But the two candidates who are coming second, the most interesting is Brad Lander, and he's sort of the progressive candidate, and he made climate change a central plank of his plan for the pension. And as I say, they actually, at the beginning of the year, the New York officials came out and said they divested about $4 billion in fossil fuel assets because they see it as being almost at this point essential to their ticket, to their platform, which was not the case 8 years ago. But where I think the huge danger is that they just don't do anything for another 8 years because it's such an important political issue, but it's not truly considered a financial issue.
So tying that back to Reimagining Capitalism, there's an opportunity now with this New York City election for the Comptroller is to put in place people who will be the asset owners for large pools of capital that will be allocating that capital across the global economy that will have real world impacts on the lives of workers, on communities around the world, and on the climate. And so it's very important for individual citizens to be aware that their vote for Comptroller of this kind of office that many people haven't heard of actually has an impact on how we think about capitalism moving forward. Is that fair?
Yes, but what I'm saying is voters keep asking the wrong questions. That it's not just about reimagining capitalism or asking politicians for pledges to achieve political goals. It's about trying to reimagine fiduciary duty to include, to think about the concept of sort of a duty of care to mean caring about these broader issues, and not just how much money can I make in the short term.
And so that's about accountability. And really, accountability is emerging as a kind of theme for 2021. And David, you took on the Gates Foundation strategy for global access to COVID vaccines. What's that about?
Well, yeah, Brian, among the many, many disappointments of the last year is the failure of this grand plan to get vaccines to low-income countries on anything like an equitable basis. We had been very keen on the Gates Foundation strategies to do that. They're, as you know, one of the bigger backers of global health, certainly one of the bigger non-governmental backers. And they had funded most or all of the biotech companies that jumped in and pursued a vaccine. And as you know, that was record time to reach so many effective vaccines, only to find that the plan to distribute those vaccines in particularly in low-income countries had basically hit a brick wall, and the strategy that they laid out just plain and simple, and I don't think there's much debate about it, did not work. The G7, as you mentioned, is meeting to try to pull together a backup plan. And so we started to look at, well, why this strategy that had held so much promise, didn't actually play out. And what we came to is that these global access agreements that they put in place when they do these biotech investments turned out, in effect, to not have the kind of teeth that, I think they thought had, and that were touted to have, to enable low-income countries, through this buyers club mechanism called COVAX, to enable low-income countries to compete with rich countries and be able to secure access. Those biotech companies that were supposed to provide that global access under these investment agreements just didn't. They went with the highest bidders, and here we are.
Capitalism reimagined.
Well, that's just part of the thing. The rules not only have to be, sort of the right rules, they have to be enforced and, as you say, accountable. And there needs to be power to make it stick.
All right, well, there's much more to discuss on this, but that probably seems like a good place to leave it here. That's going to do it for your Impact Briefing this week. Thank you, Imogen.
Thank you.
And thank you, David.
Thanks to both of you, as always.
You can read more on all of these stories at impactalpha.com. Impact Alpha's podcasts are available wherever you listen. Impact Alpha subscribers make our journalism possible. Join them and receive the daily brief and full access to Impact Alpha content. Podcast listeners get $100 off their first subscription. Go to impactalpha.com/subscribe and use the code BRIEFING100 for your $100 off. Thank you so much for listening, and thanks to Imogen Rose Smith, David Bank, and our fearless producer, Isaac Silk. I'm Brian Walsh, head of Impact for the fintech company LiquidNet. Until next time, take good care.